When I ask you to imagine a city from before the past few hundred years, what do you imagine? Do you imagine people crowding around in narrow, winding streets to haggle on local markets? Basically the kinds of places you saw during your Euro trip last summer, except maybe minus the tacky souvenir stores and overpriced currency exchanges? Well, take a look at this. This is the KhAnubis Way in Alexandria, as depicted in Assassin's Creed Origins. And if you look closely, you might notice something that seems a little anachronistic. Like, is that a crosswalk? Connecting sidewalks? 2,000 years before cars were even invented? So that all made me wonder, how did cities function in pre-modern times, before cars, metros, railroads, or even proper sewers were a thing? How different was city life before the Industrial Revolution, and how similar was it to today? One thing is immediately clear when comparing ancient cities to their modern counterparts. They were far smaller, both in area and in population. In AD 100, Rome is thought to have boasted a population of over 1 million people, all squeezed into an area of barely over 13 square kilometers, including the parts of the city that spilled out past the Servian walls. While 1 million people is hardly anything to sneeze at, hint hint, a city of 1 million today is hardly impressive in the slightest, what with cities like Tokyo holding 40 times as many people. But assuming the 1 million number is accurate, this means Rome at its height was about 3 times denser than modern Manhattan, or even denser than modern Manila. One of the main reasons for this, of course, was transportation. Without any cars or bikes or even any sort of public transportation, most people just walked everywhere, limiting cities to the radius of human stamina. No surprise about that, but that sort of understates the role of horses and carts in pre-modern cities, which even in 49 BC would have necessitated wider roads and boulevards, such as Alexandria's KhAnubis Way. They understood basic road hierarchy, what can I say? But of course, these carts weren't darting through the city center at 50 kilometers an hour, and these wide boulevards weren't exactly closed off to pedestrians like their modern counterparts. So what gives with the crosswalks? Well, if we look at images like these of Pompeii, we see that the stones making up the crosswalks were actually raised up quite a bit off the ground. With so many horses and draft animals on the roads, it shouldn't be surprising to anyone who knows how organisms work that these roads got very messy very quickly. And so these crosswalks were not the sole designated crossing area, but were more like stepping stones, so people could cross the road without having to step in literal horse shit. In fact, cities like Rome and Alexandria even had strict rules and regulations in place on when carts were allowed inside the city's gates, so they wouldn't jam the already crowded streets. Wait, walls, that's another thing cities don't do anymore. Up until a few hundred years ago, cities generally had some sort of fortification, which was another factor keeping these cities so small. That doesn't mean development never happened outside of a city's walls, quite the opposite actually, as that's often where a city's ports were located, but this yields one particular question: why don't modern cities ever build walls anymore? Well, for one, the answer doesn't have to do with cannons, but as anyone who's ever tried this in Minecraft knows, city walls were incredibly hard to build. But there were also a lot of other factors making walls more expensive than they were worth building and maintaining. One source I came across in my research suggests that the gradual economic shift from storing one's wealth in animals and metals to checkbooks and bank accounts, which are arguably far harder for raiders to just run off with, at least played a large role in making city walls obsolete. Regardless, by the 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of cities stopped surrounding themselves with traditional walls in favor of strategically placed fortresses, such as the star forts of the colonial era. Walls weren't only used for defensive purposes, however, as can be seen with the remnants of the Berlin Customs Wall, not to be confused with the more famous wall from the 20th century. By the 18th century, the city's old defensive walls had fallen out of use, and were instead replaced by a much shorter wall going around the city, built not to keep out siege armies, but to levy taxes and tariffs on goods going in and out of the city. So while they couldn't necessarily keep out an invading army, they were good at keeping people from sneaking carts past the customs gates. Most of this wall has been torn down these days, however, including most of the gates, leaving behind nothing but their names in the form of all the S and U-Bahn stations ending with the word Tor. The only one standing, of course, is the world-famous Brandenburg Gate, named so, like most city gates, after the city it led to, in this case, Brandenburg, which would also explain why nearby Potsdam also has a Brandenburg Gate. This was also the case in Alexandria, of course, where the KhAnubis Way passed through the KhAnubis Gate, forming a road that eventually led to the city of KhAnubis. Not to be confused with KhAnubis. In the age of city walls, though, gate areas were public spaces in and of themselves. Taking advantage of the thousands who may have passed through on a given day, markets were not an uncommon sight near a city's gate. And gate areas were also a really good place to go if you had a message you wanted lots of people to hear, as attested in the Bible. Within these walls, however, when looking at a city like Alexandria or Harappa or Chinese cities like Xi'an, you might notice something about their layout. Grid patterns. While many cities like Rome or Athens grew organically from a central point, gradually expanding generation after generation, other cities would have been built with a bit more intentionality. A Chinese text from the Spring and Autumn period, known as Kaogongji, meaning something like records on the examination of craftsmen or study of work records, actually lays out a specific plan for building a new capital city.
When designing a capital city, it should be laid out in a square grid measuring 9 by 9 li per side, with 3 gates on each of the city walls. There should be 9 streets and 9 avenues, each wide enough for 9 horse carts to pass abreast. The palace should be in the centre of the city, with the ancestral temple on the left, temples to the deities on the right, office buildings in front, and a marketplace behind.
Many cities, however, would have started off as small villages or communities around a particular fortress, or might have grown organically around markets, natural harbors, intersections and pathways, places that looked cool, or wherever, or any other sort of place frequented by lots of people. In the case of fortresses, these often evolved into the center of their respective cities. Across the ancient Mediterranean, for instance, cities often featured a fortified center elevated on a hilltop called an acropolis, such as the famous Acropolis of Athens or the Bursa Hill of Carthage. However, that's not all that goes into a city. What ultimately makes a city and not a village or a large walled compound is that cities are the result of enough people coming together in one space to specialize in different fields that could never be supported in a smaller settlement. Now, villages allow for some specialization, but try to open a jewelry store in a small farming village or a Ferrari dealership in Monowai, Nebraska, and your result is the same: poverty. So, what was it actually like to live in one of these cities? In Rome, a popular kind of domicile among the plebs, if I'm to use that term literally, was the insula, essentially a 3-story apartment complex. Well, 4-story if you include the ground floor, which was mainly for shops. This proximity to food stores would have been especially useful before refrigerators, but the apartments themselves frequently had their own kitchens, and many even had running water as well as indoor toilets, connecting to the city's sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, which drained directly into the Tiber. Yeah, this is your quick reminder not to over-romanticize the past. You might have just been drinking feces water. Well, okay, that's not entirely true, as Roman cities were fed by their oh-so-famous aqueducts, as were particularly useful in cities like Constantinople, which even to this day, as Istanbul, needs to bring in water from elsewhere. You can learn more about that in my video on Istanbul's geography. These aqueducts brought in water from far-off springs and lakes before being spread throughout the city in a vast network of pipes, mostly made out of lead, before emptying out into a nearby river or harbor. Rome was far from the only civilization with indoor plumbing too, as civilizations like the Indus Valley, the Hittites, and Kilwa also had their own complex urban plumbing infrastructures. Now, zoning wasn't exactly a thing in ancient and medieval times the same way it is now, as that only became more of a thing during the Industrial Revolution, what with making it so people could not build a giant factory in the middle of a mostly residential area, but there were generally some rules and regulations in place. Butchers being probably the most notable business confined to certain areas because not everyone enjoys the smell of raw meat in the morning. Finally, if you wanted to enjoy yourself in the city, a variable number of deities know that you were not strapped for options. Want to watch a drama in a theater? It's right there. Want to see gladiators fight in an arena? Can't get that in the provinces. Or do you just want to go to a park and relax? That was sometimes an option too, although mostly later on. And be careful you weren't just walking on some prince's hunting grounds. Now, not to get all not just bikes on you, but with all the talk these days of good urban planning and how that seems to involve building cities the way we used to in the distant past, or at least before car dependency, it all begs the question, would a history-loving pro-urbanist like myself want to live, not just visit, but live in a pre-industrial city? God no, I love having human rights and a steady treatment for my IBD, but we can still learn a lot from the past, and in particular, how a lot of the issues our cities face today aren't actually all that new. Different people, different technologies, similar struggle. Malaka. Now I should be very clear in that I had to cut out a lot from this script in order for this video to actually exist. At least outside of the creative purgatory that is, this isn't perfect, this could still be a little better. So I'm not giving you anywhere close to a complete picture of all the complex, intricate ways hundreds of millions of people lived in places thousands of years and kilometers apart from one another. But whether you're putting together some sort of medieval fantasy world, building a realistic Roman city in Minecraft, or you're, just curious, hopefully this video has given you at least a glimpse into the giants on whose shoulders we stand.